in the month of Ramadan and in the nights of Ramadan. And that will enable us, inshallah, to follow the instructions and the commands in details that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala outlines for us in the Quran. And inshallah, we achieve the concept of taqwa and will be among those, who fasted the month of Ramadan imanan wa ihtisaban. Fasted the month of Ramadan out of belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and out of belief that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded us as Muslims to fast, and that is a pillar of Islam. Wahtisaban, and of course anticipating the reward from none but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Anticipating the reward from none but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And just to touch upon a couple of things around the month of fasting. There's a very common fabricated hadith that goes around that the first 10 days of Ramadan is mercy, and the second 10 days is forgiveness, and the third 10 days are itq min an-nar. This hadith is unauthentic. This hadith is unauthentic. All of the month of Ramadan is a month of mercy. All of the month of Ramadan is a month of forgiveness. All of the month of Ramadan is a month of sparing us from the punishment and the torment of the hellfire. So this hadith is unauthentic. Having said that, we'll talk about the hardships that some people may face during the month of Ramadan. As we start out by saying that fasting is obligatory upon every Muslim, male and female, reach the age of puberty and is of sound health, is non-traveling, and is of sound mind. So therefore, when we talk about illness, we need to understand what illness is. I'm talking about the illness that gives the one the rukhsa, the act of ease that allows them to break their fast during the month of Ramadan. And when we talk about travel, what type of travel that actually gives the one the rukhsa, the act of ease, not to fast during these days. And then we talk about old age. And not old age is equal. In other words, there's no such a thing when I hit 50, or when I hit 60, when I hit 70. No, there are parameters. There are categories that the scholars establish, and sometimes these categories can overlap. And we'll explain that in details, inshallah. So starting, فَمَنْ كَانَ مِنْكُمْ مَرِيضًا أَوْ عَلَى سَفَرٍ. Here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exempts those who are ill. So if someone has a toothache, someone has a headache, someone has a migraine, someone, their shoulder hurts, their arm, that doesn't mean you can break your fast. So the illness that the scholars speak about is an illness where if you were to fast, your illness is exacerbated, means that it's going to become worse, okay? Or there's a fear of loss of life, or loss of limb, or parts of a limb, or that your illness will be prolonged. In other words, the illness usually would last a week or two, and it may take months now for you to recover if you were to fast. So this is the type of illness that we are permitted, to break the fast during the month of Ramadan if we experience any of that. And then of course we talk about, pregnancy and nursing and all of that. And subhanallah, out of the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there's a dispute among the scholars whether a pregnant woman or a nursing woman can break her fast or not, and that is really left up to her. Every woman is more aware of her body and what she can tolerate and what she's experiencing. I'm talking about her personal experience, and whether she's able to nurse if she was to fast. Obviously the concern is, for the child, right? And so in addition to, for us, to become also clear, in our conscience, is that a nursing mother, right, or a pregnant mother ought to consult with her doctor. So now she would have basically absolved herself from the responsibility, and cleared her conscience that I am breaking the fast. I have valid, from Sharia standpoint, Sharia compliant or valid reasons or excuses to break my fast. So it's not a question of how I feel or what mood I'm in this morning or any of that. So that's when it comes to, illness and pregnancy and nursing. Now, when it comes to travel, the scholars basically set 48 miles as the threshold. And that's, we accept that. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. Ask the people of knowledge if you do not know. But what do we need to add to that as well? Am I traveling by vehicle? Am I traveling on a donkey? Am I traveling on foot? Right? because obviously you travel for 48 miles, on a straight highway, right? It could make that distance in 30, 35 minutes, 40 minutes, 45 minutes, right? And many of us, commute for an hour a day, just one way to get to work. So is that considered travel? Some scholars basically say if you leave the city that you're in and you go to another city, then you consider it to be traveling. Well, what if I live in the state of Maryland, just before the bridge, and I cross to the state of Virginia? What happens then? Am I traveling? Obviously, that's not traveling, right? So as you can see, there are, there are considerations here to take into account when we look at the statements of the scholars. We're not overriding the statements of the scholars, but we are also, based on what we know, because the scholars may live, some of them who issued this fatwa, they lived in small towns, and between one town and the other, perhaps, the travel distance of walking half a day. So that is considered travel. But now I have a car. If I was to go back and travel between the two towns, I'll probably make it in 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 40 minutes. You're talking about paved roads, you're talking about vehicles travel at 70, 80, 90 miles an hour. I don't suggest you go 90 miles an hour. Just, right? So you can cross that distance in like a very short time frame and you don't feel like you're traveling. So we have, and I don't want to, divert from the topic, but I'm just going to throw something at you for the sake of understanding. We have 5 grand fiqh rules in Islam, and one of which says al-'ada muhakkama, means that the tradition rules. So in other words, if I live in a small town and I'm going to the next town, in the mind of the average person, the average reasonable person, am I traveling? In my own mind, am I traveling? Especially if I'm going on foot or I'm riding a donkey or something like that. The answer is yes. People consider that to be travel, right? But if I was to travel from, I live in Rockville and I work in DC, and it's going to take me 45 minutes. So I'm traveling from one state to another. Am I really traveling? In my mind, no, I'm not traveling. True or not? So therefore, whether you're traveling or you're not traveling, you need to take all of that into account before you make that judgment. And also, we cannot invent a travel in the month of Ramadan just to break the fast. إنما الأعمال بالنيات وإنما لكل امرئ ما نوى. Deeds are judged according to intentions. Every deed we perform is judged according to our intention. And that's why sometimes some will receive the reward for the same action while others don't because of the intention. And I would just share with you the hadith, where the Prophet ﷺ, there was a person who was in love with a young lady. So when the Muslims left Mecca to go to Medina, all of them left, fi sabilillah. They were pretty much persecuted in Mecca, as we all know, and they left, fi sabilillah. But there's this one person who was in love with a woman, and she left with the first wave of migration, if you will, from Mecca to Medina. And so he was so much in love with her, so he left, to go catch up with her. So the Prophet ﷺ said, إنما الأعمال بالنيات وإنما لكل امرئ ما نوى. فمن كان هجرته إلى الله ورسوله فهجرته إلى الله ورسوله. Deeds are judged according to intentions. So whoever migrated from Mecca to Medina for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, following his Prophet ﷺ, that is their reward. ومن كانت هجرته لدنيا يصيبها أو امرأة ينكحها فهجرته إلى ما هاجر إليه. As for one who migrates because of a worldly cause, so it's not fi sabilillah, it's for a worldly cause, or for a woman, that they fell in love with, then their migration is for whatever they migrate. In fact, the Prophet ﷺ did not even repeat that sentence again. He said, for whatever they migrated. In other words, there is no reward for that. There is no reward for that. So that's when it comes on. I'll open the floor for question and answer, inshallah, later on. But I'm just trying to quickly cover the topics and set the parameters so we can proceed on to the main segment, which is, fasting for the elderly. So that's when it comes to illness and the threshold of illness, and then travel and the threshold of travel that allows one to break their fast during the month of Ramadan. Something to keep in mind, fasting during the month of Ramadan is not like fasting outside of the month of Ramadan. Take this as a rule of thumb. Every obligatory act of worship can never be equated to a nafilah. Cannot be equated to a nafilah. It means it's of higher caliber and it's much closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the authentic hadith, وَمَا تَقَرَّبَ إِلَيَّ عَبْدِي بِأَحَبَّ إِلَيَّ مِمَّا افْتَرَضْتُهُ عَلَيْهِ. It is never the case that my slave can come close to me, except first and foremost when it comes to the obligatory that I made, that I've obliged my abd to worship me with. So that's the first line of coming close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is to perform the obligatory. And the scholars teach us that إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَقْبَلُ النَّافِلَ حَتَّى تُؤَدَّى الْفَرِيضَةِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not accept the extra act of worship until the obligatory act of worship is performed. I'll just give you a simple example. Someone is not paying their zakah, but say, but I give charity, and I'm generous, I give charity. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not accept this charity. You have to do the obligatory first. You have to pay your zakah first. Someone says, well, I do qiyam al-layl. I don't pray 5 times a day, but I do qiyam. Your qiyam al-layl is not accepted until you perform the 5 daily prayers. Okay? إِنَّ هَذَا الدِّينُ دِينُ اتِّبَاعٍ لَا ابْتِدَاعٍ. This is a religion of following, not a religion of invention. Now we come to the main segment of the talk, which is, the elderly. Obviously someone could be 70 years old and they're perfectly able to fast. And I know many people like that. They're 70, they have their health, they can fast, no issues. And then some may reach 55, 60, and they are unable to fast. So people are going to vary. So there is no, specific age that we say, okay, this person now can break the fast, so this person cannot. So what are the thresholds? So there are 3 categories here. Obviously, in every act of worship, there's a certain level of hardship that is associated with it. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about the salah. He says, وَإِنَّهَا لَكَبِيرَةٌ إِلَّا عَلَى الْخَاشِعِينَ. That praying is something, a great deal. You got to perform your wudu 5 times a day. You got to pray 5 times a day. You got to go to the masjid for the men. All of that. That's not an easy thing to do. True or not? That takes quite a bit of time, quite a bit of effort, right? Especially when the weather is not, it's too hot or too cold or any of that, right? But so this is like for the average person who's healthy and able to walk back and forth to the masjid or drive or any of that. That's basically a hardship that is part of the ibadah. That is a hardship that is part of the ibadah. And we all know, there are pillars to the salah, and there are wajibat, obligatory acts to the salah, and there are sunan to the salah, right? And we ought to perform at minimum the pillars and the obligatory. The sunan, if you perform it or you leave it out, it'll either increase or decrease your reward. It'll either increase or decrease your reward. But when it comes to the pillars, you have to stand up. وَقُومُوا لِلَّهِ قَانِتِينَ. Stand up in your salah. That's how you, right. But sometimes people are unable to stand up. Sometimes people are unable to sit. So the Prophet ﷺ said, صَلِّ قَائِمًا فَإِن لَمْ تَسْتَطِعْ فَجَالِسًا فَإِن لَمْ تَسْتَطِعْ فَمُتَّكِئًا فَإِن لَمْ تَسْتَطِعْ فَمُسْتَلْقِيًا. أو كما قال صلى الله عليه وسلم. Pray in a stand-up position and perform your ruku' and your sujood and recitation, all of that. If you cannot, then sit, right? If you cannot, then, recline, right? And if you cannot, then lie flat on your back. So you can see, people have different, capacities, but those who can, then they must stand up. They must bring that pillar, without which the salah is invalid. The same thing for the wajib. And of course, I don't want to go into fiqh salah, but I'm just giving you some examples. Okay, so now we know that there's a certain level of hardship that is part of every ibadah, including giving zakah, right? So we ought to, we commanded to give zakah, with good heart, that this is obligatory act of worship, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to purify us and purify our wealth. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will replace it with that which is better. But separating oneself from their wealth is not an easy thing to do, right? Al-malu wal-banuna zinatul hayatid dunya. The wealth and the children are the ornaments, the beauty of this life. And oftentimes you find people bragging about what? Their wealth and their children. True or not? Right? My son is this, my daughter is that. They have this job, they're making this much money, they live in this home, they live in this area, right? So al-malu wal-banuna zinatul hayatid dunya. So separating ourselves from our wealth is also a hardship. Abstaining from eating, drinking, and intimate relations from the break of dawn, to sunset during the month of Ramadan, especially on hot days, right? For long hours, that's a hardship. But there's an extra layer of hardship. And sometimes that extra layer prevents us from fasting. So if someone reaches like a fragile age, a very old, fragile age, and now if they were to fast, they could faint. They could get sick. And obviously with old age comes what? All sorts of illnesses. Our body's internal organs begin to weaken or deteriorate or any of that. So fasting for an extended period of time could cause one to lose their life, to lose a limb or part of a limb, or to get ill, right? In that case, not only they are permitted to break the fast, they're obliged to break the fast. Why? Because another fiqh rule among the 5 grand rules that I mentioned to you at the beginning, la darara wa la dirar. In practicing the deen, you cannot harm yourself and you cannot harm others. You cannot harm yourself and you cannot, means that if fast in the month of Ramadan, right, and you're ill, and this is going to prolong your illness, or is going to intensify your illness, or is going to cause you to lose your life, or whatever, then you are prohibited from fasting. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, مَا جَعَلَ عَلَيْكُمْ فِي الدِّينِ مِنْ حَرَجٍ. He has made this deen a deen of ease to practice. But a word of caution, it is a religion of ease to practice, but not everything we perceive to be easy will make it part of the deen. Okay? You understand the difference, right? It's a religion of ease. Means that every time, you feel like things are closing in on you, they're becoming more and more difficult beyond that hardship that is part of the ibadah, then you know that now you have a way out. صَلِّ قَائِمًا فَإِن لَمْ تَسْتَطِعْ فَجَالِسًا. Pray standing up. If you can't, sit down. If you can't, lie down. If you can't, go flat on your back. But you cannot give up the salah. You still have to pray. So similarly with Siyam, if one reaches an old age, and that happened to the Sahaba, by the way, so this is not something just specific to us. So Anas ibn Malik, we all know who Anas ibn Malik is, the servant of the Prophet ﷺ. In his old age and the last year or two of his age, he could not fast. So what did he do? فَيْطَعَامُ miskin. He would give food to a miskin or a poor person. Only these 2 categories, either a miskin or a poor person. A poor person is more intense in their poverty than a miskin. So a miskin could have something, but insufficient, but a poor person has nothing. Okay, and the scholars use the story of Musa alayhi salam when he went on his journey. وَأَمَّا السَّفِينَةُ فَكَانَتْ لِمَسَاكِينَ يَعْمَلُونَ فِي الْبَحْرِ. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala described that the ship that was that Al-Khidr put a hole in, it was for masakeen. So they had a ship, but it was insufficient to sustain them. So therefore, a miskin is something, has something, but insufficient. A poor person who pretty much has nothing. So only these 2 categories that you can feed. Only these 2 categories. So this is the first category, which is pretty straightforward for someone who reached a very old age and they're unable to fast, right? And most likely they will never be able to fast again. What is the measure? غَلَبَةِ الظَّنِّ. Preponderance of the evidence. None of us know the ghaib, the unknown. But في غَلَبَةِ الظَّنِّ, this person most likely will never be able to fast again. Do they have to feed? Yes, they have to feed. They have to feed, for each day they break the fast, a miskin or a poor person. So that's clear, right? We come to the other category that, there's a bit of a hardship. Maybe it's a little bit more than the average person, but nothing that's going to cause them to die or get ill or lose a limb or any of that. Just a little bit is part of aging. Just like part of aging, you have difficulties walking, right? You don't walk as fast. If you fall, you don't get up as fast, right? The list goes on, right? So in this case, that is no excuse for one to break the fast. That is no excuse for one to break the fast. Similar to that is the illness that we talked about. Somebody has, a little headache, a toothache, their leg hurts or their arm hurts. That is not a justification for them, to break the fast. So similarly with old age, if it just adds a little bit of a hardship and everything becomes more difficult with age, true or not? Everything becomes a little bit more difficult. So that does not give one the rukhsa, the act of ease to break the fast. Now we have a category that is in between the two. And then we have another category, okay, that we're going to talk about at the end. So the category that is between the two is sort of like could be confusing. Yeah, I'm having much more difficulties, but it's not to the extent where it's really, impossible for me to fast, or it's going to make me ill, or any of that. Or sometimes it could be just a little bit more than, the easier one that we talked about, which is the second category, is that a person who's find it just a bit more difficult, in their old age to pray and to fast and do all of that. So there's like in between. So this one, the scholars basically say, similar to a woman who's pregnant or nursing. You use your own judgment. You're certainly more aware of your own body and your challenges. And if you were not to drink for a long time, what's going to happen? In addition to that, you would ask who? Your doctor. So now you've exhausted both areas. You have, based on your own experience and your own knowledge. But why the two? Because asking the doctor, sometimes you could say, well, it looks good, for your age. But in your case, but I'm really having difficulties fasting. I feel like I'm going to faint. So the doctor doesn't know everything. So, he or she are a professional in the field, and their judgment is important, right? But also your judgment is just as important. And at the end of the day, the measure is the taqwa. Okay? So don't put yourself at risk of losing your life or a limb or getting ill or prolonging your illness. And at the same time, don't take this as, oh, I'm old, khalas, I've hit 60, so I just break the fast. Now, we have, if you will, a fourth category. And that fourth category, an older person during the summer days. If Ramadan falls in the summer, very long days, very hot, I can't really fast. It's just too hard for me. But guess what? I can fast in the winter. I'm unable to fast in the summer. The days are hot, they're very long, and I just can't do it. But I can do it in the winter. In this case, they would break the fast in Ramadan in the summer, and they would make up for it in the winter. If they do that, right, then there's no fidya. You don't have to feed, a poor person or a miskin. You don't have to feed a poor person or a miskin. So these are, in general, the four different, categories that the scholars basically teach us about, the month of fasting and the fiqh of fasting for the ill, for the traveler, for the older person. And they use basically the measures from the Quran, from the ayat that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in one says, لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will only hold us accountable according to our fullest capacity. And that's something we need to understand, fullest capacity, right? Because sometimes people misuse or misinterpret, these ayat to accommodate their own way of thinking, their own whims and desires. You need to pray 5 times a day. Oh, لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها. This is in your capacity to pray 5 times a day. So you cannot use it as they don't go to for Salat al-Jum'ah. لا يكلف الله نفسا. No. This is you're misusing, these ayat. You are interpreting these ayat according to your own whims and desires, meaning that this person has taken their Lord as their own mind. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَفَرَأَيْتَ مَنِ اتَّخَذَ إِلَهَهُ هَوَاهُ. Do you see one who takes his deity, his Lord, the one who receives command from, be it permissibility, prohibition, obligatory, all of that, their own way of thinking. Their own way of thinking. I will stop here, inshallah, and open the floor for, questions and answers. Subhanak wa bihamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Yes, sister.
I want to ask that the business said that on the summer with fasting to winter is hard. So the reward is the same.
Inshallah, the reward is the same, because in the authentic hadith, the Prophet ﷺ said, if one is to travel or to get ill, while they're traveling or while they're ill, whatever they used to do in terms of acts of worship, that continues to be written for them. They will continue to receive the credit for. What has prevented them from doing that is what? The travel or the illness. So similarly, once reaching, a fragile age and they're unable to fast, the hot days of Ramadan in the summer, and they basically exert in the fullest capacity, just like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands, لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها. So they fast, the days, they make up for these days in the winter.
You just mentioned that you make your fast in the winter months because you cannot fast when it's hot during the summer months. I will pass that information to the people that I know, but I know they would say to me, where is that written? Are you able to tell me where it is written?
Absolutely. Inshallah, there's not a question that you will raise except I will answer from the Quran. Agreed? Okay. So the ayah that is mentioned, لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will only hold you to your capacity. It is not within your capacity to fast the month of Ramadan in the summer. So what do? We don't fast at all?
But what some people do, and I know of this, is what they do, they actually fast for the period that they're able to during the summer. So if the fasting ends like 8 o'clock at night, and they're not able to go to 8 o'clock, they might stop at 6 or 5.
I don't know of any scholarly opinion that...
No, but that's what
No, but you see, we don't go by what people do.
Yeah.
We go by قال الله وقال الرسول وقال أهل العلم.
Within their capability, also they're fasting within their capability.
No. You see, sister, if I have a medical issue, do I walk up to anybody in this room and say, I have a medical issue, give me your expert opinion? Right? I may end up dying if they're not a doctor. Okay? So therefore, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, I will only give you answers from the Quran and the Sunnah. And in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. Ask the people of knowledge if you do not know. They are the experts. They are the heirs of the prophets and the messengers. And the prophets and the messengers did not bequeath dirham or dinar, means money or wealth or any of that. They bequeath knowledge. So therefore, we don't ask the average person. We don't go by what the average person does or says or whatever. That's their own interpretation. And that interpretation is invalid. Because they're not qualified to interpret the Quran. They're not qualified to interpret the Sunnah. They're not qualified to give fatwa.
And it's not been written by any scholar. Because sometimes they say, this scholar said that, and this scholar said that.
No. We do that with children when we train them. Like a 5-year-old, okay, you're going to fast till 12 noon, okay? They just, and the next year when they're 6, okay, you fast till 1 or 2, right? So this is part of the training process. But for someone to start inventing, we said in هذا الدين دين اتباع لا ابتداع. This is a religion of following, not invention. So therefore, you have to go by the Quran and the Sunnah and the interpretation of the Quran and the Sunnah by the experts, which are the scholars.
And that's how it applies to people in Alaska, for example, when they just have like a few hours of night.
Yeah, there's a fatwa about that by the scholars, is that for those who 23 hours are like daylight, they're not going to fast 23 hours, right? So, well, the way they do it, they basically said, you measure based on Mecca, like how many hours do they fast in Mecca, and they follow that fatwa. Is that they have to, portion for it, just like at the end of the time, when the day becomes a month and becomes a year. So the Sahaba asked, "Oh Prophet Allah, what do we do when it comes to Salah?" He said, then you measure, you measurably apply that. So when that time comes, we go back to the scholar and say, what do we do now? Okay?
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome, sister. Right, but remember we mentioned that you have to go back to your doctor, right? And ask the doctors, like, I am obligated to fast the month of Ramadan, and I'm supposed to be taking medications 4 times a day. Do you think I should fast or not, based on your expert opinion? If they say, yes, you can do it, for example, take 2 doses before, I'm just giving you, I'm not giving you a fatwa here. But because you see that the scholars base their fatwa oftentimes on what the experts in their respective fields say. So if the doctors say don't fast, no scholar is going to come and tell you fast. Make sense? And one example we know from the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, when a group of the Sahaba were on an excursion, and then a rock fell from the mountain and hit one in the head. So they treated him the best they could. And then when the time came for salah, he said, do you find a rukhsa for me, an act of ease, where I don't have to take, this bandage, or right? Because now you're exposing the wound for what? For infection. And especially it's in the head, right? So they said, no, we don't, you have to take it off. You have to wipe on your head and all of that. And what happened when he did? He died, right? And when the news reached the Prophet ﷺ, what did he say? He said, you killed him. So the scholars will never give you a fatwa, right, where the doctor says you cannot fast and they say, no, you have to fast. Or the doctor say, yeah, you can fast, and say, no, you don't have to fast. They base their fatwa on the knowledge of the deen and the knowledge of the experts of the dunya. That's how so there's nothing arbitrarily done there. Okay? So if you're taking medication 4 times a day, you gotta consult with your doctor and see if he can take all these doses at night. And if the doctor says, no, that's gonna make you ill, then khalas, you have your reason not to, not to fast. You're very welcome. We'll take one last question. The sister just raised her hand. Okay, we'll take one last question.
If you are traveling and the distance is acceptable, where you can interrupt your fast, if you choose not to interrupt your fast and you want to continue to fast, that's acceptable.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. هذا والله تعالى أعلى وأعلم. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا